Here's a concept. I'm not saying it's necessarily likely, but Nintendo likes left field approaches, and this seems like one way to solve one of their major problems: how to transfer decisively to Switch 2 without cutting Switch users off completely. So, the idea is this. What if, from the moment Switch 2 releases, Nintendo never releases another Switch 1 game again and still offer support to Switch 1 players so they do feel included going forward? Sounds impossible? Perhaps, and this is a left field possibility, but let's talk about how it could work. The idea would be that as of the first day Switch 2 is on the market, every subsequent game that is released would be a Switch 2 game. Switch 2 branding, Switch 2 everything. However, some cartridges would have on them a notification that there is a special Switch 1 mode included, as well as indicating that there is some functionality there for Switch 1 play. However, what this Switch 1 play mode could be would differ hugely from game to game, and there would be many different possibilities. Firstly, though, nobody who is still engaged in the system could possibly, after this, ignore the fact that Switch 2 would be here, and anybody who purchases a Switch 1 game is by default going to be picking up a Switch 2 title as a result of this change, and therefore already building up their Switch 2 collection. It doesn't mean that they have to follow through with a console purchase, but it makes the sunk cost effect kick in to the point where many will feel inspired to do so, especially if the Switch 2 version provides clear advantages over the Switch 1 play experience of the same cartridge. Let's look at some examples to see how this might work. Take Metroid Prime 4. We have assumed that it will come out with Switch 1 livery in some form, but what if it's released as a Switch 2 game outright, only one stock keeping unit? Rather than releasing a second version of a title that is already quite niche, they instead say that by popping the Switch 2 cartridge into a Switch 1 machine, you will be given access to a version of the game. In the case of this long-awaited game, it could even be pretty much the same title that's running just a little less well. Presumably storage wouldn't be an issue given Nintendo's famed ability to compress their games down, so they could probably have two versions of the same game on a single cartridge. But if not, setting the expectations that Switch 1 fans may need extra storage space for downloads going forward is just a very subtle early nudge towards pushing people into Switch 2 without completely isolating the Switch 1 audiences. But it's early days and they promised Metroid Prime 4 for Switch several times, so this kind of means the promise, if you squint a bit. I could imagine a couple of early titles being launched on Switch 2, but with cartridges playable on Switch 1 in the same way. Pokemon Legends ZA may be another such title. However, soon Switch 2 games will need to offer far more limited functionality for Switch 1 players. For a title like Kirby Planet Robobot, it feels plausible that such a title could launch before Switch 2 even drops, and this would certainly fit with the pattern of Kirby being the final major first-party title on a Nintendo console, as has happened in the past. But what if even this game is a Switch 2 title? There could be some additional modes, a bit like Magolor's Epilogue on Kirby Return to Dreamland Deluxe, which are specially gatekept for the Switch 2. Of course, this isn't how Nintendo would present it. They just say that these extra modes utilize exclusive Switch 2 features, and hey, they may well do. HAL and Nintendo work closely together, and doing some new side modes for a transfer of a Kirby title that utilizes mouse mode or whatever other innovations Nintendo may have up their sleeve doesn't seem exactly beyond the realm of possibility. Note here, though, that Switch 1 owners would instantly be paying a premium, Switch 2 prices for Switch 1 titles. In a sense, this might seem unfair, but what it does do is demolish one key reason to stick with Switch as opposed to upgrade: game prices. If Switch 2 games are, as seems likely, $70 a standard, Switch 1 games might appear so much better value. Except now everything will be $20, or at least in that top range, and now Switch 1 owners are essentially paying a tax for not upgrading. Harsh, maybe, but a definite nudge to power up. Clearly, not all games would need to have a Switch 1 mode, and after time, most may not. But where the option makes sense, there's no reason for it not to have some kind of Switch 1 accessibility. I discussed previously the case of Famicom Detective Club, a series likely to return maybe around 2027 or so, and in this case there's no real reason not to sell the game with a Switch 1 mode as long as the new title doesn't make such extensive use of mouse mode that it will be impossible to play on the classic system. On the other hand, the big exclusives like 3D Mario wouldn't need a Switch 1 mode very likely because they will be so grounded in the Switch 2 technology. This also solves a problem Nintendo has when it comes to re-releases. We know at minimum that a far more graphically outstanding version of Breath of the Wild is already running on the new console, as it was widely reported that developers were shown this months and months ago. That doesn't necessarily mean that the game is about to drop, as it makes sense to use a high-profile title that gamers and developers already know rather than risk an original title leaking for something like this. On the other hand, we know Zelda games tend to get remakes after roughly 10-year intervals, and so a new version of Breath of the Wild sooner or later does feel likely. But do they want their new, likely $70 version of the game sitting on the shelf alongside the Switch 1 original? Surely the answer is no. Physically, they are going to want to clear the shelves of game stores of Switch 1 titles in a reasonable period of time. Not completely, of course. They will still want some of their newer titles still to be there, but generally speaking, they won't want the limited space in physical outlets dedicated to an older system. And indeed, if they can push gaming stores to focus on Switch 2, then it might even make more sense to do a digital-only late in life fourth model Switch 1 at a lower price, something I've touched on in separate videos recently. So instead, it makes sense to create special Switch 2 editions of these games. For Breath of the Wild, they can just say it's a complete edition featuring the DLC. They did release a version of Breath of the Wild in Japan and a couple of Asian regions with the DLC already on the cartridge, but they've never done a wide-scale release of such a version, and so I think they could easily do it if they so wished. This alone would probably, in Nintendo's eyes, even if nobody else's, justify a $70 price tag. The question is, what do you do with Switch 1 players who wish to buy Breath of the Wild? Why, sell them the Switch 2 version. If the cartridge is either capable of storing both versions or is used effectively to activate a download code for the original title when loaded on Switch 1, it seems plausible to me that they could use one cartridge for both games. The Switch 2 version could be sold as the main one, but there would be some functionality feature for Switch 1 players. This is irrespective of whether they sell DLC updates to existing Switch owners or not. In fact, if they see the new game as a discrete Switch 2 release, they may not even offer an upgrade capacity for existing Switch players. In fact, I think the first obvious title for a Switch 2 edition re-release would be Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, which I feel is at least a 50% chance to be trailed before the end of the year. A complete edition for $70 would be amazing value even for Switch 1 owners, assuming they haven't owned the game previously, so the cartridge could still play for Switch 1 owners in Switch 1 mode. But on Switch 2, you would get the full experience, including presumably additional content or at least the promise of further DLC. The old Super Smash Bros. Ultimate for Switch could be retired and the stock would simply run down to nothing. However, there are still potentially dozens of games that could stand Switch 2 re-releases. These would be titles that they will want to keep on the shelves for the whole of the next generation, rather than letting them skulk off into the background until a new edition comes out. So, for example, titles like Yoshi, Paper Mario, Splatoon, 2D Zelda and Donkey Kong have new titles coming every few years, and so would not be ideal for re-release. Same with even bigger and rare titles like Animal Crossing. The next system is not going to want competition from the juggernaut that is New Horizons for its new Animal Crossing game. However, there are some titles which would suit these kind of re-releases very well indeed. One such title is Ring Fit Adventure. Ring Fit Adventure is the kind of title people will continue to come to for its evergreen nature, and so they will want to continue to have it available, but it's not clear just how much it suits a sequel using the exact same mechanic. I would love to see Ring Fit DLC, just allowing more different locations and perhaps even video gaming crossovers, but Nintendo may see their best bet as being to release a Switch 2 edition that simply features expanded modes. By having it playable on Switch 1 as well, they can ensure that it can still be purchased by the widest install base possible. It would also suit any titles where they don't immediately want to go back to the well for something new. Super Mario Maker 2 didn't exactly conquer the planet in the same way that the original did. I love the game and its sales were very healthy indeed and may by now have even crossed the 10 million mark, but there's no doubt that it was the poor relation of the 2D Mario series when even the likes of New Super Mario Bros. U Deluxe was racking up monster sales and often hanging around in Nintendo's top 10 sales chart. A new Mario Maker game would be time consuming since they've more or less taken the current concept as far as it can go. They could certainly add on some extra modes. A Wonder mode would be very exciting, but would this really justify being a Mario Maker 3? Better perhaps to re-release Super Mario Maker 2, leverage the large install base and set of courses from the original title, and maybe just give it another wave of support of DLC to re-engage people. I could see this happening quite soon, if anything, since the 40th anniversary of Super Mario Bros. Is coming up, and for that matter, so is the 10th anniversary of Super Mario Maker, which makes it an ideal time to don the hard hat, and of course, Super Mario Maker 2 would benefit a lot from mouse mode. This would certainly solve some of the difficulties people had with the original version of the game. Of course, if they were using the title as a showcase for mouse mode, this is perhaps a good case for making it a full Super Mario Maker 3, and that is certainly possible since it will be 2 years since Super Mario Bros. Wonder, and the EPD10 team could conceivably get something together in this time. Either way, I feel that there is a 30% chance that we will see more Mario Maker in some form by the end of 2025, and Mario Maker 2 Deluxe does feel like low-hanging fruit. Of course, then there is Mario Kart. I have explored the options around Switch 1 Mario Kart before, and there were certainly some spicy comments in that video, but my observation then was that a flat-out cross-gen was unlikely, but that allowing Switch 1 players some way to play, perhaps just as a stream demo for expansion pack users, is reasonably plausible. But maybe there is another option. The more ancient among us may remember the wonderful case of Sonic & Knuckles, the 1994 Sega Mega Drive game which featured so-called lock-on technology, a cartridge into which you could plug in other cartridges. If you plugged in Sonic 3 and Sonic 2 into the Sonic & Knuckles cartridge, you got a different and expanded version of those games. But if you plugged any other Mega Drive or Genesis game in, you got an endless challenge run of the Sonic 3 special stage levels. It wasn't much, but it was a bit of fun and certainly extended the experience. The reason I reference this is that I could see a similar approach being taken here. Plugged into Switch 2, the Mario Kart title will unlock maximum goodness, but there's no reason not to give some kind of mild reward to Switch 1 owners as well, the equivalent of the Sonic Special Stage Rush. Perhaps some of the multiplayer modes are accessible. Perhaps if there are 48 tracks on day one, the Switch 1 can even access 12 or 6 or even just one as a demo. Of course, the game would feel very limited in this mode, constant messages entreating you to upgrade to Switch 2, but that would be the point. Nobody could really complain that the game was barely playable for Switch 1. This wouldn't be a Switch 1 game, but a Switch 2 title that just happens to have a bonus mode for Switch 1 players out of the deep generosity of Nintendo's heart, and in no way to activate pester power from children who want to play the full game. Heaven forfend such an idea. The great advantage of a Switch 1 mode is also that it kind of ties into the idea of the Nintendo Switch and playing it your way. Perhaps you have a family with a Switch 2 and an old Switch Lite. Well, now someone can still get enjoyment from the Switch 2 cartridge without needing to have access to all the features that are Switch 2 exclusive. It also means they can avoid that messy period where Switch 1 and Switch 2 are on the market together. From summer onwards, every game will be a Switch 2 game, but Switch One owners will still have a seat at the table. As with any left field concept, I'm not sure how likely this idea is. The traditional expectation of there being some Switch 1 games and separate Switch 2 games still has to seem much more likely, given that it might be difficult to explain at Christmas in advertisements that these games are Switch 1 compatible as well, and if Nintendo still wants to get another Christmas out of the Switch 1, this might go against their interests. Technologically, putting two games onto one cartridge, even allowing for the necessity of downloading additional content, may be too problematic for Nintendo. Switch games have had downloads before, but these haven't exactly been popular. However, I'd say there is maybe a 30% chance that they will find some way to build Switch 1 content into Switch 2 cartridges this year, and if they can do this, then the whole cross-gen window might look very different from anything that we've seen before. Thank you as ever for watching. Huge thanks to my Patreon supporters as ever. Please do like, share, comment and subscribe, and I shall see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.